Good morning to you all. Thank you. My name is Dave. I'm one of the pastors here at Gold Hill, and it's my privilege to be able to share with you this morning. I have been away this past week. I've been off sailing on the Norfolk Broads with about 40 or 50, about 40 or 50 young people. There were some other adults there as well. It wasn't just me. We've been off enjoying God's creation, learning about our identity in Christ. Thank you for those of you who've been praying for me as I've been there. It's been an amazing week. It's been an exhausting. In fact, I'll tell you what. I realised how exhausted I was on Friday when I was doing some washing up on my boat, and realised that after about 5 minutes of struggling, that the reason it wasn't working very well is that I was using olive oil instead of washing up liquid, and it. Oh my word! That's the level of tired I got to. But I'm back. I'm feeling fresh-ish, and it's great to be back with you. It's been an amazing week of exploring our identity in Christ and exploring who He has made us to be. And really, what it all ended up boiling down to was: are we going to choose to live as Christ has made us to be, or are we going to live as we can be by ourselves? Are we going to choose to believe the things about us that we believe or that other people might say about us, or are we going to believe what God has said about us? That's been what I've had the privilege of exploring with a bunch of young people this week. And in some ways, that's what I have the privilege of exploring with you this morning. Because I want to explore the question, what is it that turns this, for those of you listening to the recording of this, I'm holding up one of the palm leaves before it's been folded into a cross. What is it that turns this into this, the cross? Because on Palm Sunday, as Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, people were laying palm leaves before him and robes before him. They were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They were welcoming their coming king. They were excited for him. They were passionate for him. They wanted his best. They wanted him to be crowned and to be glorified. And then by the end of the week, some of those same people were shouting, "Crucify." Some of those same people scattered as soon as Jesus was arrested. Some of those same people denied even knowing Jesus. What is it that turns a palm leaf that's a sign of Jesus being our king, someone who we want to follow, into a cross? What is it that turns faithfulness in Jesus towards letting him down? I want to explore that a little bit this morning, not so that we can all feel bad for the times that we've let God down, because should we just have an open forum and say we all have? Very good. Not so that we can feel condemned about that, but so that we can learn some lessons about how we might develop faithfulness in our own lives. So I was preaching on this same topic in the first service, and where Eunice came up to me afterwards and said, "We don't often hear much about that." I'm going to be speaking this morning about Judas and the lessons we can learn from Judas and his life. What was it? Because he was amongst the crowd that were shouting "Hosanna to the Son of David" and were welcoming Jesus as his king. And yet he didn't just shout "Crucify." He betrayed his Saviour, he betrayed his friend so that he would be crucified. What is it that led him on that journey? What were some of the reasons and the motivations for him? And how can we try to avoid betraying Jesus? How can we try to have the faithfulness that Judas himself did not have and seemed unable to have? That's what we're going to be thinking about this morning. And if you have a Bible with you, if you could turn to Mark chapter 14, that would be fantastic. If you don't have a Bible, then I can see some of the stewards gearing up to bring one round. If you want to just shoot a hand up, then they will wing one to you as quickly as possible. Mark chapter 14, and we're going to have to sort of skip some bits out, because the whole story of Judas isn't told in one passage in one go. It's sort of interweaved through the other goings on in Mark's Gospel. So we're going to start in verse 1 of Mark 14, where we read this. "It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people.'" This is sort of chapter 1 of our story. As the chief priests and the scribes, the religious leaders, decide that they need to find a way, stealthily, to arrest and to kill Jesus. They want him gone. They see him as an enemy. But But they can't do it publicly. It would have been really easy when he was teaching in the temple, or he was out and about with a crowd of followers around. It would have been very easy to just go up to him, identify him, arrest him, and take him off. But they didn't want the backlash. They didn't want the riots. They were worried that particularly at this time when lots of people were in Jerusalem and there was lots of celebrations going on around the Passover, they wanted to make sure this was done a bit more quietly. But it's hard to arrest someone quietly if you don't know where they are, and so they needed an insider. This is the people who wanted Jesus gone and their predicament. Let's skip forward to verse 10, where we read, "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12," notice one of the 12, that comes up a few times. He was one of the 12, "went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him." Interestingly, we don't get much of a sense here of why it is that Mark chose to step up and to betray Jesus, why he chose to be the solution to the problem that the chief priests and the scribes had. We learn a little bit more about his motivation, actually, when we look at some of the other Gospels, which we'll be doing in a moment. But for now, what we can see is that he offered himself to them, and they offered him money in return. Maybe we get a sense of his motivation, but for now, that's really all we learn. Let's go a little bit further on to verse 17. This is part of the Last Supper as Jesus shares a meal with his friends. Verse 17, "When it was evening, he came with the 12. And when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, 'Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me.' They began to be distressed and to say to him one after another, 'Surely not I?' He said to them, 'It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born.'" So we see the need from the chief priests and the scribes that someone would come and betray. We see Judas being willing to do, and now we see Jesus being fully aware of what's going to happen. And he talks to his friends, he talks to the disciples and says, "One of you is going to betray me." Does anyone else find their reaction a bit strange? Their reaction that says, "Oh, surely not me, is it?" When Jesus, a few verses later, says to Peter, "Peter, you are going to deny even knowing me." Peter's reaction is, "No, I'm not going to. That's preposterous. That's ridiculous. I would never do such a thing." He tells Jesus that he's wrong. The 12 disciples here, they don't say, "No, I'm not going to do that." They don't say, "I'm not going to do it." They're looking around at one another and going, wait, is it me? Am I going to be the one that does this? I draw a little bit of comfort from that. Because it seems as though, to one degree or another, all of these 12 men felt as though they might have been at least a little bit capable of letting Jesus down. The idea of letting him down, the idea of doing something that might betray him, they might not have thought that he meant something quite so blatant as what Judas would do, but they all had this feeling that maybe they could be the one that would end up letting their friend down. I draw comfort from that because I know that I am very capable of letting Jesus down. I don't want to let him down. I want to be faithful to him, but I fail. I want to learn some lessons this morning about how we can avoid being those people. But I want to start from just the place of honesty that says, I know that I can let Jesus down. Just like all of these disciples felt, oh, maybe he is talking about me. Maybe I will let him down. Let's carry on reading a little bit further on. We're going to focus a little bit more on verse 21 there that we just read in a moment. But for now, let's skip ahead to verse 43 of Mark 14, where we see the betrayal actually happen. Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. And with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now, the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. That's all Judas did. I say that's all Judas did. It's a very serious thing, but in practical terms, what he did was he shared Jesus' location and he identified him. That was what Judas did. That was his crime. There's the far deeper crime, of course, of betraying Jesus, of choosing to take the power away from Jesus, choosing to take matters into his own hands, choosing to ally himself with Jesus' enemies. But that is what Judas did. This act of coming up to him and kissing him, we may think of this as a very intimate thing. We may sort of think, it was a deep betrayal because it was intimate. This was a normal greeting from a student to a rabbi. He was treating Jesus in some ways in this moment completely unemotionally. He was coming and giving the greeting that you would give to a rabbi. He was treating him as teacher, not as friend. He'd given up on Jesus as friend and as Lord, and he was treating him just as his teacher now, the one that he'd traveled with. Judas has given up on what Jesus is doing, or at least given up on the way that Jesus is choosing to do it. So what is it that motivated Judas? What is it that made him give up? What is it that turned this into this for Judas? Well, I think that there are at least three things going on, and I want to think about each of them. I think there are at least three different forces working in Judas's life that are driving him to do these things. The first is a set of very human motivations, a very human way of thinking about the world, and a very human way of acting. Judas was Judas. He was a man, he was a human, and he thought like one. He thought in many ways like we can think. And he was driven by all kinds of things. He was driven by things that weren't all from Jesus. We know, for example, that he was driven by money. If we turn quickly to John chapter 12, then we read this. Just after a woman has anointed Jesus with very expensive perfume, Judas is not happy. John chapter 12, verse 4. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" Sounds as though Judas is in line with what Jesus is saying, serving the poor. Then we read in verse 6, he said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. So, what's motivating Judas? Well, at least in part, money. He was someone who was driven by money. He had this position as someone who looked after the money pot and gave money out to the disciples so they could buy food and they could live. They all shared. They had things in common. And he stole from it. He was driven by money. Money was something that was more important to him. If he was discharging his responsibilities well, he would not have been stealing the money. He would have been using the money to further the ministry that Jesus is doing by supporting his followers, by supporting Jesus himself, but instead, he's taking it for himself. For him, money came higher, at least some of the time, than Jesus. Which meant that when it came to the crunch, and there was an opportunity, money, once again, came higher than being faithful to Jesus. Now, I'm sure that started quite small for Judas. I don't think that he, from day one of being Jesus' follower, had his eye on the prize and thought, right, if I get close, if I get in, then one day I'll have the chance to make some mega bucks from the chief priests and the scribes. That's not how it started for him. But money was something that had a hold on his heart. And ultimately, it led to him letting Jesus down. The word that we use for that is an idol. Something that we put higher than Jesus, something we give higher priority than Jesus. For Judas, one of those was money. For us, it might be money. I don't think money's a bad thing, nor do I think some of the other things that we might put as idols in Jesus' place are bad things. I don't think family is a bad thing. I don't think career is a bad thing. I don't think status is a bad thing. I don't think church is a bad thing. I don't think a lot of the things in our lives are bad things, but when they occupy the place that Jesus has, when push comes to shove and we have to make a choice, do we do something for Jesus' sake or do we do something for money's sake? And when those two things contradict one another, which way are we going to go? That's a choice that Judas had to make, and he made the wrong one. Where are the areas in my life? And there are at least a few, there are at least some. Where are the areas in my life where I put something else or someone else higher than I put Jesus? Knowing where those things are, knowing where those weaknesses are for us, can be so important. Because then we can do something about it. We can choose to say to Jesus, Jesus, help me to love you more. Help me to serve you more than serving that thing. One of the ways that we can be faithful to Jesus is by trying to dismantle and demolish those things. But there were other human motivations that Judas would have had. So we're still thinking about the sort of very human side of things. And one of those human motivations would have been disappointment. I think he had a different view of what Jesus was going to do than what Jesus was actually going to do. He was following the Messiah. He was following the leader. He was following someone who was going to get rid of their enemies and give freedom and liberation. He had an expectation about how Jesus was going to do that. He thought he was joining up to be part of an army. And Jesus didn't seem to be working like that. I'm sure there was a time when Judas believed in what Jesus was doing, believed in Jesus' message. He may not have understood it fully, but he believed in it. But Jesus has disappointed him. Jesus isn't following through on what Judas thought Jesus was meant to follow through on. He was disappointed. Things hadn't gone to his plan, to what he thought Jesus' plan was. And so there must have been a turning point, a moment, when Judas thought, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't why I left my home and traveled with Jesus. This isn't what I signed up for. Jesus isn't the person I thought he was. He isn't the person I wanted him to be. Some people interpret Judas's actions, and I don't know, this may have been part of it. Some people interpret Judas's actions as actually trying to provoke something in Jesus. So Judas wanted Jesus to be this freedom fighter, to be this insurgent, to sort of rise up against his enemies. And Judas still had a hope that Jesus was going to be that. And so he handed him over to his enemies so that Jesus had to rise up, had to start fighting. And then Judas could join in with that fight. I don't know if that's what's going on. It could be. But whether that's what's happening or not, there's a sense in which Judas is done with Jesus being the Jesus that Jesus came to be. Judas wants Jesus to be someone else. And if he's not going to be, then he may as well give up on him. He may as well look out for his own needs. So there are very human motivations going on in Judas's life. And like Judas, I am a human. You'll be glad to know. Which means those same motivations can drive me. Those same things can affect me and can affect you. The things that I prioritize above Jesus can drive me to do things which Jesus wouldn't want me to do. It may not be on the extreme level of what Judas did, but I don't even want to betray Jesus or let him down a little bit. So I don't want those idols to have even a little bit of a hold on my life. Which means I need to ask the difficult question, what are they? And how can I choose to love Jesus more? Will I ask him to help me do that? And where, if I'm brutally honest, do I feel disappointed by Jesus? Where do I wish he'd done this or he'd been that? Where do I wish that actually Jesus would do things my way and he would do them in my time? And when I'm faced with those times when I am disappointed by Jesus, when I am disappointed because I would really rather things were another way, in that moment, what choice am I going to make? Because there's a choice between saying, well, I'm so disappointed in you that I'm going to say you haven't been faithful and your plans are wrong, and so I'm going to pursue another plan. I'm going to go a different way because I don't like what yours is. You must be wrong. Or am I going to say, Jesus, help me to see how this is the right plan. I'm going to trust you over me. I may be disappointed in you. That's because I need to be gently helped, not because you have actually let me down. Judas, it seems, never made those steps. But it's a step we can make, to go to Jesus with our disappointments in him and say, I don't understand this. I'm confused. I'm hurt. Help me to see this from your perspective. You tell me your story of what's going on, instead of clinging on to our story. So there's the human side of what Judas was doing, which can affect us. There's also a spiritual side of what happened with Jesus. In John 13, as Jesus is getting ready to wash his disciples' feet before the Last Supper meal, We read this, starting at verse 1 of John 13. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. There's something spiritual going on as well. And there's something spiritual going on for us as well. Yes, Judas was motivated by money. Yes, he was motivated by his own disappointments in Jesus. But there was also spiritual forces at work in this whole event. We read the devil had put it into his heart to betray Jesus. There are forces at work in the world that want to thwart God's plans, that want to thwart the work that Jesus is doing. And sometimes they want to use us to do it. They want to take us down the wrong track. They want to put wrong ideas and wrong thoughts into our hearts so that we will go in a wrong direction. In Revelation chapter 12, there's some very symbolic language which we don't have the time to go into in full detail. But there's a picture of a woman who is giving birth to a child, and the child signifies the hope and the promise and the future that God has for his people. There's also a dragon who is there trying to thwart that, trying to kill that child. Revelation chapter 12, starting at the first verse, says this, and I'm sorry we can't go into the detail of all the symbolism and everything, but the main point hopefully should be clear. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in the heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. That's a picture of the devil being thrown out of heaven after his rebellion against God and taking a third of the angelic beings with him, and those then becoming his demonic forces on earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. That's a picture of this child, this human child, Jesus, the hope of the universe, the one who has the eternal throne. And the devil knew that Jesus was the way that God was going to achieve all of his purposes. And so the devil thought, if I can thwart Jesus, if I can kill him before he comes to do what he's come to do, then maybe God won't win. Then maybe Jesus will lose and the devil will win. That was his aim. He had no idea what God was trying to do in Jesus. He didn't know that God was going to win that victory, not through force and by power, but through sacrifice and through death. So he was thinking in the way that a tyrant thinks, which is, if I can kill my opponent, then I win. That's why he put it into the heart of Judas to betray Jesus. That's why he was at work in that way, in order to bring about what he thought was going to be his great victory, and ended up being his great downfall, because it was at the cross, as Jesus took sin and as Jesus took judgment, that actually he won that great victory over the devil and over those demonic forces. We still find ourselves in a spiritual battle. It's not one that has an uncertain outcome. We know the end. We know that Jesus wins. We know that because he rose again. And all of God's enemies have been defeated. Their final downfall is still to come. And at the minute, the devil is still at work in our world. The devil and all of his forces are at work in our world, trying to take down anyone he can with him. He's lost and he knows he's lost. But he's still fighting. We need to be aware of that. And we need to know that in our lives, and for our choices, and for our decisions, there is a spiritual battle going on. We need to be choosing to clothe ourselves, and to ask the Spirit to clothe ourselves, so that we would not be led off astray. Exactly where the spiritual element of Judas's decision stopped and the human motivation started, we don't know. Those things aren't always as clear-cut. They're sort of separate. They merge into one another. Maybe his love, or maybe his disappointment of Jesus created a space in him where he wasn't sure what he could do, and that gave the devil a way in to say, well, maybe do this. And then he realized that he could profit from it, and that was a whole package that came together. You are a physical human being with a brain and a mind. You're also a spiritual being with a soul and a spirit. Don't try and disconnect those things artificially, but both drive you. And we need to submit both of those things to God. We need to ask him to purify our motivations and our intentions, and we need to ask him to strengthen our spirit. Those are things which, for one reason or another, didn't happen in the life of Judas, but they can happen in your life, and they can happen in my life. We can choose to be faithful because God can help us to be faithful. So those are two forces going on. Judas's own motivations as a human and dark spiritual forces. I think there's a third, and it's slightly different. I read in Mark 14, verse 21, this: "For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed." It's almost like there's a contradiction in that one verse. Because Jesus, the Son of Man, is just going as God has already ordained, as has been written. He's going the path that God always knew he would and always knew he must. And yet, woe to that one who does it. Judas. So isn't that unfair? Isn't it unfair that Jesus can say in one breath, Judas is doing what God has always known he's needed to do, and in some ways what God requires him to do in order to bring about God's purposes. And yet, he's going to be judged for it. Isn't that unfair? I don't think it is. I don't think it is, because Judas was making the decisions Judas made, and he had control to do it or not to do it. It was a choice he made, and yet, through that choice, God worked out his purposes. God will always achieve his will. God will achieve his purposes. Sometimes he does it through us. Sometimes he does it in spite of us. I take encouragement from the fact that no matter how much I might mess up, I cannot destroy God's plans. And yet, I don't want to mess up because I want to be a conduit through which God achieves his plans. I don't want him to have to work around me. I want him to work through me. Judas had given up on Jesus, and he did things which were horrible. They were horrific. They were the worst decisions to make, and yet God still worked through them. In Isaiah chapter 53, we read this: "He," that's Jesus, "was oppressed and he was afflicted. He did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that's led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice he was taken away." That's talking about what Judas did and what those who put him on trial did. By a perversion of justice he was taken away. Who could have imagined his future? "For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth." This great injustice being done to Jesus, something that was wrong, something that did not come from God because it is awful. But the passage carries on, "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities." The language threaded through those verses is that through this horrific thing, through this perversion of justice, God's will be achieved. God didn't make Judas betray Jesus. Judas chose to do that. And yet God was still working. Don't think that your failures are ever final. Don't think that your failures have ever stopped God from achieving something that he wants to achieve. But do think that you have the privilege and the joy of being able to work with God for his will. There are others in the story of this Easter week that we're going to be journeying through together as we remember what Jesus did. There are others who did remain faithful to Jesus. There are the women who went to the tomb. There are the women who stood at the cross, and some of his followers, some of the disciples, and stayed with him in those moments. No one was perfect, but some people were more faithful. Some people were part of achieving God's plans through their faithfulness, and some people through their lack of it. That's a choice we need to make. Will we ask God to strengthen our spirit and strengthen our resolve? Will we look for what God's will is? Will we ask, God, what are you wanting to do in my neighborhood? What are you wanting to do in my life? What is your will? So that I can walk in step with it. If I know what your will is, I can chase towards it. If I don't know what your will is, I'm just wandering around blind. And if I do know what your will is, and it challenges me, and it's something that I find uncomfortable, will I make the choice to pursue it anyway? Or to step back and you'll have to work around me, God? So there are at least three forces going on in Judas. There's his own motivations and priorities, which for us God can purify and God can make whole. There's the dark spiritual forces, which by the Spirit living in us, we can wage war against. And there's God's will, which will be established, will be made complete. And we have the privilege of being able to walk with him in. I ask you to close your eyes and bow your heads for a moment and maybe think of a situation in your life that you're facing which is tough, either of your own making or someone else's, or just because life is tough sometimes. Lord, I pray that in those situations, you would give us your grace to be faithful. That whether we feel as though we're making a right pig's ear of things and we need your help to turn around our own behaviors or our own actions or our own motivations, or whether these are situations which we actually have very little control over, but we need to know what your will is, so that we can be people who build towards it. Whether we feel as though we are oppressed and being attacked on all sides by forces that we can't control, but you can. I pray you would give us grace and you would give us strength. I want to be able to look back on my life and see more times when I was working in tune with you than times when I was struggling against you. So I pray you would give me faithfulness. You would give me a perseverant and a resilient spirit. Help me to love nothing and no one more than you. Help me to be an ambassador for you, to be light in this world, because you have been a light in me. And where we struggle with disappointment and not knowing if you're there or where you are, I pray you would bring comfort. Help me see the world through your eyes, not my own. In Jesus' name I pray all these things. Amen.